Well, Michigan has been on my mind like a lot of other people. It's going to come down to Michigan. Our guest is in Michigan. Our guest is a political analyst who is a writer and contributor for The Hill, the New Arab, foreign policy magazine, uh, a verified expert in matters of Michigan's Arab population, politics, Palestinian politics, Palestine, Lebanese politics. A new article coming out soon. We'll get into a little bit of that. You are a cornucopia of information that we're really looking forward to tap into here. So I want to welcome to Arabs in Media, Abdelhalim Abdelrahman. Welcome to Arabs in Media.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And for brevity, a lot of my American friends, they either call me Abdel or AJ, so everybody could address me any way they want. I know my name can be a mouthful.
Yeah, yeah. Well, same with me. I mean, Hazem Jamal, and people, call me Haz. They call me bad names. They call me all sorts of things that they wouldn't say in front of their mom. But the important thing is that we have something to say about what's going on. And I think the stuff happening in Michigan is going to either freak people out on November 5th or the days that it takes to tally the state,
hmm
or and they're either going to be happy or sad, but they're going to be a fair amount of people who I think are in deep, deep denial about the state of Michigan,
hmm
meaning the status of Michigan. First off, let's talk a little bit about your background, your story. I mentioned that you are Palestinian American. Uh, Give us an idea of your background and who you are and your history.
as a Palestinian American, I guess I could say I'm one of many other people in the diaspora who are kind of woven together by tragedy, sadness, despair, and living in exile. Many of us, our roots hail from the Nakba or the occupation of the West Bank in 1967. My family is from Ramallah. It was a city which was captured by the Israelis in 1967. And I've kind of used my identity as a vehicle of expression all throughout my academic career and not alhamdulillah my professional career. Um, I think my one goal has to always been to highlight the plight of the Palestinian people through a both humanitarian standpoint and also a political standpoint. As it pertains to American politics, the American political system, and even U.S. law. It's certainly not for the faint of the heart. I definitely do wish I was talking to you under better circumstances. But unfortunately, I think I speak for a lot of other Palestinian, of course, Arab Americans when we say that death and carnage seems to only be the only thing that wakes the world up to the plight of Palestinians in just the broader Arab world. And I think that's where I lie on that issue. That's kind of what it is about me. When I was in college at Michigan State, I often wrote about issues pertaining to kind of how Israel had hoarded and hogged all the natural resources in the occupied Palestinian territories as it pertains to water, crops. When I was in grad school, I wrote about intra-Palestinian affairs, the mechanisms of the Palestinian Authority, the whole kind of political division between Fatah and Hamas, between Gaza and the West Bank. And, I think now we're kind of seeing the combination of all these elements come to the surface as we discuss what Palestine is, where the national movement goes from here in this post-genocide era, unfortunately.
Mhm, mhm. Do you think people who are born into the struggle have less legitimacy with non-Palestinians for their story being shed light on? In other words, do people who speak on Palestinians' behalf, do you think they have carried more weight in terms of people listening to what your stories are? You were talking about things that you discussed at Michigan State during your undergrad years, and all I could think of was nobody has wanted to hear that story. for the longest time,
No.
and you must have faced a lot of resistance when you were, pre-genocide, dealing with people who probably just didn't think this was a real issue.
Yeah, and I think what you really hit the nail on the head there. I think that the Palestinian cause has very much been invisible to the ordinary American. I think a lot of that is by design with the way how academia is set up, and of course our American political culture, and that a lot of that is stemmed from our military alliance with Israel and giving them $4 billion a year. I think as it pertains to like those who speak out on Palestine, are they properly articulating, the Palestinian cause? Well, I think it largely depends on what we're referring to. For an example, if you're somebody that likes the Piers Morgan show, then you're listening to Musa Hassan Yusuf every day, who wrote this book about how he was a son of Hamas, and now he says he hates all Palestinians and he calls Palestinians a criminal ideology. Well, if that's where you're going to consume your information from, and I'm not speaking about Arabs, I'm speaking about broader Americans in general, then you're going to have a negative perception of them, right? But if you listen to individuals who, like, for example, like Noah Arafat, who's a law professor, who was later to Saeb Erekat, who was the Secretary General of the PLO, has extensive knowledge about the struggle of the Palestinians and all of its intricacies and facets, then you're going to come away with a greater understanding of what Palestine is, where the struggle is, how it lies. But I think the problem in today's media are two things: is that it's so easy to dehumanize Palestinians. And we're like a political punching bag. I mean, you turn on any television network, even the most progressive news stations are always kind of ripping on us. And I think that's just indicative of a culture that doesn't want to shed light on any granular issues. Like the fact that the West Bank is basically split up into four cantons with zero autonomy, divided by settlements, divided by checkpoints. You have to talk to an actual Palestinian about that. You're not going to get that from the TV news because they're not going to talk about that. They don't want to talk about that. So I think that there's a lot of prominent voices out there who know what they're talking about, but unfortunately they're kind of fleshed out, drowned out by what I like to call nonsensical media, which just frames Israel Palestine as just like another day in the neighborhood in the Middle East, and not this ever going colonial plight that Palestinians have had for 76 years.
Right, right. Have you been paying attention to the book tour for Ta-Nehisi Coates with The Message?
I have.
It's pretty fascinating. What's
It
your
is.
take on this?
My take is this, is that I think Ta-Nehisi Coates hit a nerve in American society. It's interesting, Ta-Nehisi Coates goes to Hebron, but us Palestinians, we call it Al-Khalil. And anybody that has gone to Al-Khalil will tell you, outside of Gaza, it's probably one of the most criminal places on earth and is the epitome of the Israeli apartheid. There are separate roads, there are separate infrastructures that Palestinians and Jews can and cannot enter. And they're treated not as second-rate, but third-rate citizens in their own city. So when Ta-Nehisi Coates goes to Hebron and he sees this dynamic, he says that the Israelis have practically created a system of racial hegemony and hierarchy that is akin to Jim Crow. And as the American political system and media often tries to portray itself as the purveyors of liberalism and tries to portray Israel as like this, defender of liberalism, that strikes a nerve with them that somehow Israel can do wrong. And you saw when Ta-Nehisi Coates is being interviewed on CBS, well, the interviewer responds by saying, well, what about this? What about that? The Palestinians have had agency and autonomy. Where do Palestinian decision-making going into this? Ta-Nehisi eloquently replies by saying they have no agency. So he has now, I think, reactivated a much deeper conversation that we need to have about the Palestinians and kind of where their place is under Israeli apartheid. But it's not a conversation that Americans want to have, unfortunately.
I saw that interview and I was obsessed over it as well. Played it back a million times, broke it down, looked at some of the other media interviews that he conducted for his book since then.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because that interview was so much of an ambush on CBS that I think every other media interview has had to kind of backtrack on what they might have attacked on because they've learned that people are ready for the conversation and the argument now.
Yeah.
Like they're more well read than they were before, and certainly he wrote a book and is more read than the average American, I think.
That's the thing. Oftentimes I think the American media would oftentimes bring in interviewers who are smart in their own right, correct? But not sophisticated on the manner of Palestine. And when they're hit with the average Hasbara talking points, that individual doesn't know how to counter. Well, Ta-Nehisi Coates was one of the very few people right now who are not Palestinian that could give you the history of the conflict, give you the plight of the Palestinians, and be able to say, I witnessed it. And here's why A, B, C, D, all your talking points are irrelevant. And like you said, it really shed a light on that now Americans, the average American, is no longer going to buy into this idea that it's all the Palestinians' fault. They've refused peace. They're not that they have agency, because now none of these things are true. Actually, one of the most, I would say that narrative is so divorced from reality that now corporate media is having to reckon with that. Like, oh my God, we had this kind of system in place where we could shut everything down, have this around this conversation, that now it's no longer valid.
Yeah, social media has done quite a job on that. And of course, now big tech has censored a lot of the stories as well. When October 7th happened and the initial weeks of coverage came out from Gaza and, every other story that was emerging in West Bank as well, people saw a completely different reality than what just establishment corporate media had been showing for so long. One of the benefits I see from Ta-Nehisi Coates writing the book is obviously, as you mentioned, it's your point, he cracked the veneer of what people were only exposed to before, and media is now forced to shine a light on things that were previously just never even covered. Are they doing a great job? Who knows? I mean, they're just beginning because they're kind of like backed into a corner now. But the second thing I would say is that Ta-Nehisi Coates said, hey, we need to center Palestinians as the voice at the table, having these conversations. He feels uncomfortable in the position of being the one to call out apartheid, even though it was his honest take on it. It was what his experience was. And when he brings up Jim Crow laws in media interviews and in his book, as being the closest facsimile to what is happening in the West Bank, it stops the counter arguments and the Hasbara in its tracks.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't. How do you defend apartheid? How do you defend it? I don't think there's a way to legitimately defend apartheid on American media, which is, I think, a turning point. But to the second part of that point, which is centering Palestinian voices. As a Palestinian, what would you like to see in how the stories are told, or what stories, I'm sure there are millions, are not being told that you think are doing a disservice to the average Westerner or American who honestly just feels so intimidated by what they don't know, and they've been told multiple times, this is complicated. You shouldn't try to, insert yourself into this conversation because you're not worthy of it. What would you say to that? How would you frame this conversation as a Palestinian, and what needs to happen?
I think the conversation needs to be framed around actual Palestinians who are either on the ground, meaning they live in the Dafar al-Gharbiyya, they live in the West Bank, or they live in Gaza. And I think there are already some independent news outlets who are doing a good job of this. Drop Site News has interviewed, Yunus Tarawi, who's like an OSCENT analyst, who's a Palestinian, and he's been documenting the Israeli war crimes, how they're looting houses, how they're defiling women's lingerie, how they're blowing up mosques and schools when there's empty and there's no combatants in the area. And he's highlighting this wanton destruction that Israel is doing that far supersedes the rules of war and international humanitarian law. So that's one. Two, I think also the conversation needs to also be framed in terms of asking Palestinians, how did we get to this point, right? How did we get to October 7th? The how did we get to this state of affairs where this death and destruction and devastation has come? I think it would behoove those media members to listen closely when Palestinians talk about the Nakba, because this is the launching point of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel's existence would not be possible today if 800,000 Palestinians were not expelled from their homes and either pushed out into the Middle East, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Kuwait, wherever, or forced into refugee camps in Gaza or in other parts of the West Bank, right? This is the story of the Palestinian people that needs to be spoken about more in contemporary media. And the way the conversation is framed now is that, well, that didn't happen, that doesn't matter. Often, and the points we often hear is that, well, it's anti-Semitic to talk about Israel expelling Palestinians and then creating this hierarchical system of ethnic superiority where any Jew from anywhere in the world, whether it be New York or California, Detroit, wherever, can come and live on historic Palestinian land. But those who were kicked out in 1948 can never come back to their homes. That's what the media needs to be shining a light on. And I also think there's this narrative that, when the Palestinians signed Oslo, when the Palestinians went to Camp David in 2000 and had subsequent negotiations with Israeli prime ministers up until 2008, that they were actually offered a state, right? No, I think the media needs to be talking to Palestinians about what was offered in those agreements, and we can go into that a little bit, but I want people to hear this right now who maybe aren't Arab American, who aren't Palestinian American, and want to learn more about the conflict. Or if you're just an ordinary American. If you were an American right now and Canada came and occupied large swaths in the Midwest, and they told you that they would divide you into cities where but you couldn't move freely, and Canada would build settlements in between those cities, and that, by the way, Lake Michigan and Lake Superior, we would control all the natural resources and the water inflow going into these cities. Is that a state? No, that's what we call an entity that can be controlled. Nobody ever talks about the fact that Oslo and Camp David were designed to pacify, not illuminate the Palestinian cause or Palestinian statehood. This is the problem that I have with it personally as a Palestinian, and this is what has led us today to the modern-day apartheid, division, and segmentation of the Palestinian territories. You never hear about that in the media.
Right. Well, that brings us up to today. I mean, there's a huge gap of knowledge from people who have only heard what politicians have parroted to them. And as an example, I'll give you Hillary Clinton, who very early on, during the media barrage of politicians talking about what they know best, she went on MSNBC among several appearances, and she said, well, they walked away from peace. They walked away from their chance to have a state. They'd be, in their own state for 25 years now if they hadn't turned it down. And I think that's something worth studying for everybody who wants to know more contextually about what happened with Oslo. It was never meant, and Israeli politicians stated as much, to give Palestinians statehood or even dignity for that matter.
No.
Let's bring it up to where we are today, because the campaign pressure on Michigan is, it's either going to come down to Pennsylvania or Michigan, and both of them have their different, voter bases to kind of focus on. And you and I seem to be a little bit like data nerds, where we'll see the polls and we'll, talk to people and take notes and try to get the mood and the feel and the tone of what's happening on the ground. Polls have shown that if the Harris campaign were to adopt an arms embargo and a true ceasefire effort versus the facade of working tirelessly for a ceasefire, if they were to adopt that as a campaign strategy, it would be the deal maker. It would, potentially give 5 points in Michigan, which right now does not look like it's going to Harris by any stretch of my imagination, perhaps yours. Uh, what are the fatal flaws of the Harris campaign relevant to Arab voters in Michigan, in your opinion?
Well, I think there are three big ones. One is policy. When Biden announced, or should I say, when Biden was forced out by the Democratic elite, there was some slight hope in Michigan that Kamala Harris would differentiate herself from Joe Biden on the issue of Palestine. Because we had heard through the grapevine and through her public statements that Kamala Harris is largely sympathetic to the plight of Palestinians in Gaza, and she wants the war to end. Well, as soon as she assumes the mantle from Joe Biden as a Democratic nominee, she has done nothing to show that she's going to deviate from Biden's path. Her Assistant National Security Advisor, James Gordon, has come out and said several times there's not going to be an arms embargo on Israel. There's going to be no conditionality on weapon shipments to Israel. When you have 400,000 Arab Americans living in Michigan, half of them living in Dearborn, many of them are Iraqi, Lebanese, or Palestinian, and they have dead family members and they're dying from your war, they're going to find that incredibly insulting. And they're going to largely feel invisible based off of your policies, and they have. And I also think her biggest issue is outreach. Kamala Harris has done nothing. Uncommitted, was willing to work with the Democratic Party here in Michigan and work with her towards an arms embargo and endorse her if she did one thing, and that's uphold U.S. laws. She hasn't done that. Right? She has rebuffed Arab outreach. She refuses to meet with community leaders. And when she does meet with community leaders, I think this is very important for your viewers, is that she's meeting with people who have already endorsed her or who already worked in the government or have some type of close affiliation with her administration. And here's the other big thing. The other big thing is perception and dehumanization. When Kamala Harris is faced with protesters saying you're enabling genocide, she says, "Hey, I'm speaking. Don't talk about that." I'll give you an example. In August, she came here to Detroit Metropolitan Airport. I live 5 minutes away from it. And I knew people who were to go to her public appearance at DTW. And two Palestinian females who I think are with like the Tahrir Coalition here at the University of Michigan yell, "We won't hide. We won't support your genocide." And she tells them word for word, "Unless you want Donald Trump to win, I'm talking." She shuts them down. And by the way, this was 5 minutes after she had a conversation with Abbas Alawi, who's the head of the Uncommitted movement, and said she'd be willing to sit down and discuss an arms embargo on Israel. She hasn't done that. She's dehumanized our own people. She's downplayed our suffering. When she talks about Palestinians dying, when she talks about Lebanese dying, the big thing is that she frames it in passive voice as if, subhanAllah, they died from a hurricane. Oh, this is tragic. This is sad. There's this humanitarian disaster. No. U.S. bombs are being sent to Israel to slaughter Palestinian and Lebanese civilians. That is the crux of the issue here. And I want to hammer this one point home real quick before you go to your next question. Democrats are supposed to be different than Republicans, right? After the war on terror, Arab Americans and Arab Muslims flocked to the Democratic Party, right? Because we used to largely vote Republican. This is very true. Our parents supported Reagan. Our parents supported Bush Jr. and Bush Sr. Anybody can look this up. Anybody can see it. But after 9/11, Republicans became neocons. They adopted very hawkish policies on Arab Americans and Muslims, intercepting phone lines, surveilling mosques. We called them neocons. We left the party. So we're going to go with the Democrats. The Democrat says we'll support you, we'll protect you, we'll give you a community, and we support Palestinian rights. For 20 years, Arab and Muslim Americans have been supportive and loyal to the Democratic Party. They have nothing to show for it. Do you want to know what Kamala Harris is doing now? She's ignoring the 400,000 Arab Americans that live here in Michigan. About 280,000 of them are registered to vote, right? So considering that Biden won Michigan by 150,000 votes in 2020, that's a significant amount.
The margin is gone. Yeah.
The margin is gone, but more importantly, she's cosplaying as a neoconservative. Yeah. There's 160,000 Iraqi Americans living in Michigan, and many of them are Assyrian, they're Chaldean, they're Shia Muslim, they're Sunni Muslim, whatever the case may be. And when you're touting an endorsement from Dick Cheney, who is the architect of death and destruction in the Middle East, that just sends a message to Arab Americans and Muslim Americans living in Michigan that you don't give a damn about us. So now they're not going to support them. Jill Stein, I think, is polling at like 40% right now here in Michigan. But on a national scale, Trump is up on Kamala Harris by 2%. So Arab Americans are walking away from the Democratic Party, are saying, if you want to play that game, guess what? We can too.
I think one of the ways that I try to explain to people who are giving Arab Americans the shaming lines of, Trump will be worse, so STFU, which we can say on this podcast if you want. I'm happy to say Trump will be worse, so shut the fuck up.
Yeah.
It has a role to it, and people now completely get the picture. I've heard you say this in media interviews. How can it get worse for people who have lost their entire family?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question. I'm gonna interject here. I'm gonna talk about an article I wrote in August, or no, early July. So Biden was still president right now, so there was no conversation about uprooting him. Arabs and Muslims in Michigan don't see a difference between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, just like they didn't see one between Biden and Trump on the issue of Palestine. Let me explain why. And then I'm going to argue why you can't get worse than a genocide. So when Joe Biden ran in 2020, he pledged to overturn the Pompeo Doctrine. I'm sure you know what the Pompeo Doctrine is. It basically gutted funding to UNRWA. It closed down the PLO mission in office in Washington, D.C. He unilaterally moved the embassy to Jerusalem, stripped away the requirements that all goods from Israeli settlements be made with the label, and then shut down the Palestinian consulate in East Jerusalem. So he basically took an axe to the Palestinian cause. When Biden ran, he said, I'm going to overturn all of that. We're going to work towards a quote-unquote two-state solution. We're going to put the consulate back in East Jerusalem. We're going to restore funding to UNRWA. We're going to overturn the legal position that Trump took on settlements is that they weren't quote-unquote inconsistent with international law and American law. Well, 4 years into his administration, Biden did not overturn a single one of those policies. When Kamala Harris was his vice president, she never once said, hold on a minute, we're breaking the campaign pledge. This is bad. We're retroactively enforcing Trump-era policies on the Middle East. Okay, so the alarms were already kind of flashing even before October 7th that, wait a minute, Biden Harris did the same thing on Palestine, just as Donald Trump. Now, as it pertains to how it can't get worse than a genocide, I really want people to ask themselves a question, those people who say that. Here are the three arguments I get from online and political pundits I've communicated with. Well, Abdelhalim, Trump's going to have Trump's taking $100 million from Miriam Adelson to annex the West Bank. Habibi, it's already annexed. It's gone. The West Bank, as I had mentioned earlier in the podcast, is that it's bisected into little Bantustans that are akin to South African apartheid. They have no autonomy. There are 800,000 illegal settlers living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. There is no contiguity on the ground for a Palestinian state. So what Trump's doing is basically, or should I say what Miriam Adelson's doing right now, is paying for a label. So this idea that they're going to just, oh my God, they're going to take over the West Bank. The West Bank's been occupied since 1967. So yeah, it can't really get any worse from us there. Secondly, like I said, many of the same policies that Biden and Harris are enforcing now are policies already put together by Trump. We've endured Trump for 4 years as a community. We're more than prepared to do it again. But I think the most important thing I want people to understand is that Gaza, God, I almost cry saying this, is that it's destroyed. Gaza's destroyed, right? It's gone. Gaza's gone. It's going to take 30, 40 years to maybe rebuild it. And you're not talking about 2.5 million people without a home. Stateless, homeless, starved, besieged. Where are they going to go? I want to know what the Harris administration, I want to know what their plan is for fixing that. They're being pushed into Jabaliyah and Bethlehem and all these refugee camps, and they're saying, go to this safe zone, go here, go there. They're like human pinballs, and they're being bombed. It doesn't get any worse than that. And it's disgusting for me because it's going to get worse for Palestinians. Well, the media often talks about Gaza like it's never a part of Palestine. Like Gaza was never once a part of Palestine. Gaza is like this separate entity. They call them Gazans. They don't even call them Palestinians. No, they're Palestinians from Gaza. They're not Gazans. They're not a separate ethnicity from us. So it can't get any worse from us. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I find it's basically liberals trying to push that point to fearmonger us into voting for Trump. He's going to put in the Muslim ban. He's going to send you back home. First and foremost, read the Constitution of the United States. He can't deport American citizens, okay? And secondly, when he tried to put in the Muslim ban, I'm pretty sure like 40 state Supreme Courts rejected that and didn't implement it. And Michigan was one of them. This was a guy that couldn't build a wall, couldn't get a Muslim ban, couldn't get Mexico to pay for a wall. I mean, you want me to be afraid of the orange man when the Democrats are killing my people? I know that's a very long-winded answer, but people need to understand that.
Understanding the frustration needs to go beyond the empathy of what I call a concerned look, Kamala, which is like a Barbie pose of she has that perfect look on her face of concern when she utters the words that innocent Palestinian lives, implying, by the way, when she says innocent Palestinian lives, that there are guilty, worthy of genocide Palestinian lives, it's lip service, because ultimately policy has not reflected that. The people who I read from every part of the political spectrum all know that the genocide would end with one phone call. These are things that people don't want to acknowledge on the contortion of words and understanding to promote, why American government is paralyzed. It's not paralyzed. It's willfully cooperating with willfully promoting, programming what's happening.
Mm-hmm. It's willfully happening. And you said something so brilliant right now. This can end with a phone call. Anybody that has just a shred of knowledge of American history, there are two instances in which America put its foot down on Israel, two instances, and it yielded some positives for Palestinians and for American law. 1982, when Ariel Sharon was plummeting South Lebanon, destroying the Palestinian refugee camps, Ronald Reagan calls Menachem Begin and says, Menachem, we've got a problem. I'm going word for word here. He says, Menachem, Americans are upset. They saw a burning Palestinian child. They see a Holocaust. This was in 1982, by the way. He says, this has to end. Phone call hangs up. Menachem Begin says, I've ordered that my troops stand down. They've stopped bombing South Lebanon. Now, yes, Sabra and Shatila still happened. But he threatened to cut off all American aid to Israel if he did not stop bombing South Lebanon. They did. Reagan also suspended the sale of F-16 or F-15 fighter jets in 1986 to Israel because of other human rights abuses they were doing to Palestinians. Then also in 1992, everybody remember this, George Herbert Walker Bush. He has a very frank conversation with Yitzhak Shamir. Shamir was part of the Haganah, I believe, who was a commander who gleefully wrote an op-ed in 1991 in the Associated Press saying that Jewish terror was necessary for the creation of Israel. Look it up. This is not a lie. Yitzhak Shamir wanted to build more settlements in the West Bank for Eastern European Jews from the Soviet Union. Bush Sr. said, no way in hell. I'm conditioning all aid to Israel. Suspended a $10 billion loan. Well, not only did the settlement stop right then and there, that actually caused Yitzhak Shamir to lose his election, which then brought Yitzhak Rabin, which brought Oslo, which we know was a failure, but it brought some type of diplomatic process. When the Americans can put their foot down, good things happen, but they don't want to anymore.
Where did that will go? And, where do you think it went?
It went, AIPAC, because Bush Sr. said during that time, there's 1,000 lobbyists on the Hill right now demanding I give Israel this aid, and then there's me, this one little guy. Anybody can look it up. That sent a message. And by the way, after George Bush Sr. conditioned aid to Israel in 1992, he lost his election to Bill Clinton. And do you want to know who was helping campaign and rally against Bush Sr.? Take a guess. I want you to take a guess.
Was it Netanyahu?
No. Yes, but it was actually Joe Biden. Joe Biden went.
Okay, yeah. Well, same difference.
Same thing. Joe Biden goes in front of AIPAC in 1992 and lambast Bush and James Baker, who was the Secretary of State at the time, says, how dare he leave Israel abandoned? And he even accused Bush Sr. of ushering in quote-unquote modern-day anti-Semitism because he conditioned aid to Israel. And AIPAC then used that moment to entrench itself in Congress, and by Congress often say, hey, listen, there's no daylight between Israel and the United States. If you go against Israel, it's honestly like the mafia. If you go against the family, you'll get whacked. And in this instance, if you go against AIPAC, if you go against the Israel lobby, they're going to kill your political career. And that's why Kamala Harris is so hesitant, because she's largely reliant upon the pro-Israel lobby now to prop up her campaign, because she's not really talented or articulate enough to do anything on her own, to be honest, so she needs that money.
Yeah, if she had kind of an allegiance to winning versus ideology, then she would articulate a position about stopping the funding, stopping the genocide. And ironically, I think Trump, who is addicted to winning, addicted to I don't know if that's the right word, addicted to winning, but he'll say anything.
Mm-hmm.
And she's kind of been a person who's shown herself to be malleable and flip on fracking or other things in policy, except this.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, actually. Trump, by the way, I don't think Trump's going to be any good for our community, but he just seems to be a little bit more politically savvy at the moment. 3 hours before he went on a campaign tour, he was bragging to the media about his meeting with Netanyahu. While he's on the plane, he tweets on social saying, Kamala Harris is a Muslim hater. Kamala Harris is hanging out with Liz Cheney, who's a loser, granddaughter of Dick Cheney. They want to go to war with the Muslim world, but Donald Trump does it. And he went up 5% in the polls right after that with Muslim and Arab Americans. Because we want some hope. And when we finally hear somebody say, oh, we don't want to go to war, but Kamala Harris is making up every excuse with these mental gymnastics to justify what's happening. Yeah, it's a problem. I hate to say it, he's much more politically motivated and savvy and more plugged in than Harris right now. And it's showing in the polls.
Yeah, I think that's the thing I see over and over and over again. And honestly, I was in Michigan recently, just last week, but I was also there back in April. And I really wanted to feel what the tone was. And I talked to a few people outside of a coffee house and just wanted to get the vibe of it. And the uncommitted movement was just kind of getting started. And there was a conference that was being put together for organizing. And, the same questions I had for people then, which is, the establishment is freaking out that this uncommitted movement is going to withhold delegates, or it's going to potentially create this momentum that other people will latch onto and follow, understanding that uncommitted is an option in some states. And what do you say to those who say, if you're voting uncommitted, you're basically voting for Trump? And the response I got, very well articulated from people who knew the subject, who weren't necessarily Arab, by the way, because there aren't enough Arabs in Michigan or in the US to have this kind of energy about being anti-genocide. I mean, the peace movement, the anti-genocide movement, is a coalition of young voters, of Arab Americans, certainly, but we aren't enough in this country to be representing this, which is, I think, a fatal mistake for the Harris administration in understanding that if you just kind of like push down the Arab voice, it'll go away because it's been easy to kind of ignore it in the past. Mm-hmm. It's now plain as day, what the history of American policy has been over Israel, over the endless wars, over Iraq, over the million dead there, over the constant bombing of countries in the region by American bombs, whether it's through a proxy or whether it's American directly. And people are like, well, the quote I remember from this one guy was like, I'd ask Biden, is it worth it? Is it basically worth it to lose for this ideology? And that's where I am with this. It's like, the constant media messaging that I get from people who are being critical of the Harris campaign in Michigan less from a marketing standpoint, but more from a pragmatic standpoint. It's like the optics are terrible. Like the shushing people, the shaming people, the telling people, shut up, I'm talking, the shaming of people, shut the fuck up, Trump will be worse. All of those things optically are terrible, but they don't change minds and hearts. Uh, certainly not with Arab American voters. And you get frustrated by people's inability to be an ally to that because they're only concerned about what Trump would mean for them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you get that sense at all.
I do. I wanna unpack what you said here. Is that the Arab and Muslim vote in Michigan and more broadly the United States, but I mean the highest concentration of Arab Americans in the country are here in Michigan, I believe. I know there's like 750,000 in California, but they're more spread out. I mean, you're talking about 400,000 in Wayne County, the largest county in
Yeah.
Michigan. It's going to dictate the election, right? Now, that's assuming if everybody votes. Not every Arab American might vote. So let's just say of that 390,000, 220,000 decide to vote, whether it's uncommitted or whatever the case may be. That's going to have a very big impact on the election. Arabs and Muslims are going to have significant political power here right now in the country. And here's why. We are now vehicles of expression for what's happening to our family members and our brethren in the Middle East. And it cannot be ignored. And because Michigan has such a high concentration of Arab Americans, everybody knows whoever wins Michigan is going to win the state because they won the Arab American vote. And I think the community feels now that after decades of having to sidestep foreign policy, basically U.S. policies towards the Middle East, towards Palestine, Lebanon, and the suffering that's been there, to only vote based off of, let's say, economic or cultural considerations, now is the time to raise our voices about enacting an arms embargo. Now is the time to show that there's a political cause for being ardently pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian, anti-Lebanese, and anti-Arab. This might be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the Arab and Muslim voting bloc to really put its handprints on the election. And it's not that I don't want Trump to win, but the reality is that we're forcing a binary choice between Trump and Harris. If the Democrats lose, I'm going to say it right now, and I've been saying, and I'll continue to say it, that would be the best thing to happen to the Arab American Muslim bloc. Let me tell you why. It's going to force Democrats to do one of two things. One, to say, my God, we sidestepped Palestine, we supported Israel, it cost us this election. Now we as a party have to internalize and recalibrate our approach to the Middle East, or else this is going to keep happening to us because we have just burned and scorned 90,000 people living in Michigan, and the next time we run for a midterm or a presidential election, they're not going to vote for us. They need to have that fear in their hearts. But secondly, as you mentioned, the uncommitted movement and the anti-war bloc and the anti-war movement in general, it's not just Arab Americans. 61% of Americans want an arms embargo on Israel. 77% of Democrats want arms embargo on Israel. I'm going off CBS polling from June 2024. And I believe 53% of Republicans also want arms embargo. There was another poll that came out yesterday and says 62% of Democrats want arms embargo and 52% of Republicans want arms embargo. The tides are shifting. This country, not just us as Arab Americans, this country does not want to have billions of dollars be sent a year overseas to Israel to drag us into regional wars. I'm talking about the average American here, not even talking about the Arab American. They don't want to fight a war for Israel with Iran. They don't want their tax dollars going to go bomb Palestinian and Lebanese kids. They want health care. They want better infrastructure. They want mental health treatment. They want cheaper grocery prices. They want job creation. They want more opportunities for tool and die, work with your hands, carpenters. Can you imagine if we've taken I believe the Council on Foreign Relations had a stat that said since 1967, we've given Israel about $350 billion in military assistance. That's just in the past almost 60 years. Can you imagine if we reinvested that $350 billion here to it in America? That's what Americans are saying right now. They're starting to see a big intersection between foreign policy and domestic issues. And that's what's also driving the sympathy for Palestinians. No more No more being a war machine. No more being married to the military industrial complex. No more having messy military alliances with other Arab countries and Israel to drag us into wars. Because at the end of the day, that's our sons and daughters or our future sons and daughters that have to go fight that war. And Americans don't want that anymore. And they're sick and they're fed up with it. So I think that's why you're starting to see a lot of people either vote for Jill Stein, who were originally Democrats, or Democrats who are saying third party isn't going to win, so I'm just going to vote for Donald Trump to stick it to Democrats because they were supposed to be better and they let us down.
How do we get to the next step? Let's assume that everything that we see on the whiteboard is going to come true. And to your point, not that we want Trump to be president, but what should be our goals within that politically? I don't know if this fact is true or not, but I've read that, if the Green Party gets 5% of the vote, and I don't know if that's by state or if that's nationally, then they will get federal funding.
That is true. They do get federal funding if they get 5%. Yeah.
Okay. So to me, that would say if you're in a state that's not a swing state, even if you prefer Harris or Trump, but you're tired of the binary system, you should vote for a third party that has enough critical mass to be able to hit 5%, whether it's Green or anybody else. It's not to endorse anybody, but to really say, we want a viable option moving forward. So if you're in California, if you're in Illinois, if you're in New York, I don't think that changes anything electorally in terms of the Electoral College, but is that something that you would recommend, putting Michigan aside for a second, or is that something that, is neutralized by our current system, in your opinion?
Unfortunately, I do think it's neutralized. I mean, obviously, I'm not trying to endorse anybody here, but the Green Party has done some good things legislatively, historically in the United States. Labor laws, place laws. I mean, those are all pretty prominent and good things. I'm going to answer your question in a different way. If you really want to change what's happening right now, let's say Donald Trump wins, which I think he will. Okay, now we got to brace for 4 years of very harsh conditions for everybody. How do you get Trump and other future presidents, Democrat or Republican, to move on this issue? It's called lobbying. I don't know if you heard about this, but Tariq Habash, who was a Biden appointee, started a new lobbying organization called A New Policy. And he's starting it with Josh Paul, who worked at the State Department and oversaw weapons transfers to Israel for over 20 years. And he raised the alarm on what Israel was doing to children, torturing them, bombing them. And these two are now coming together to shift policies on Israel-Palestine to change the way the U.S. sends weapons overseas. I think it's explicitly stated in their platform that they want to condition or put an arms embargo on Israel. I think we as a community, we as an Americans need to support that type of initiatives, but also us as Arab Americans, we need to get behind that, because what AIPAC has done is lobby the hell out of Congress and create pressure to always have pro-Israel policies. Now we need to have a lobbying apparatus that could pressure Congress to have better policies on the Middle East. Now, as it pertains to this duopoly on the political system, I'm always in favor of having other political options. So if Green polls at 5% after they tally the votes, and they get federal funding, that's good, because it does provide a new alternative, and that could boost their base, that could boost their ability to campaign, and it can maybe put out other future candidates, and it can provide Americans with another tertiary third option of saying, you no longer have to be beholden to Democrat, Republican every year. Here's the Green Party. Here's a new way. So I think the shackles that were originally in place in our system to keep other third-party dollars are honestly starting to break, because people are just really pissed off. So that's how I would answer your question on how we create that change, really.
It's interesting because when I was in Michigan last week, I was expecting to get overwhelmed by political ads, but then it turned out I didn't really turn on a broadcast TV the whole time, outside of seeing TVs in the background of, if you walk by a sports bar and a game was on or something like that. But even in my hotel room, I realized after the fact that I read a book instead of turning on the TV. But I know that the TV ads are over the top and saying the spending is crazy. Like every ad is for either Trump or for Harris. But I was exposed to driving through the state and seeing the billboards. And the messaging is just, I'm going to be a media critic now, that the Harris billboards are terrible. They, let's just start with the aesthetic. They don't match the campaign logo for Harris walls. They're yellow with white. They don't match the colors. You don't recognize it. It doesn't click in your mind that this is for the Harris campaign. And then there are like 20 words on a billboard. Billboards are like 5 words to be effective. And it's like, and they're wordy and they're word salady like me right now, but also like Kamala Harris, which is like, she believes in the potential upside of not doing anything to Social Security. It's like, really? Can't you sharpen the message just a little bit better? Can't you find something that's in line with where people are first? Meet them where they are. And if there are concerns about Social Security, yeah, do part of your spend on that. But it was like avoiding the issue with every message that I saw. And then you go to Dearborn. And it's like, the campaign's invisible. There was a guy, Dr. Ahmed Ghanim, who was at a Royal Oak campaign event a couple of days ago, was ejected. And then the campaign came back with a half-assed apology on top of it. They don't even care anymore.
No.
They're not even pretending to care.
It's interesting. I hear Democrats and Kamala Harris saying, but the Muslim ban, what'd you just do the other day? You just threw a Muslim out of your campaign event.
Yeah.
I laugh sinisterly, almost cynically about it because it's like, it's so ironic. Yeah. I think the reason why you're seeing so many mixed messages about Kamala Harris's campaign, the aesthetic of her logo aside, is that when she was a senator, she had all these progressive policies: free healthcare, free education, fixed transportation, fix the infrastructure of the United States. I'm a ban fracking, all right? And then maybe we're going to have this conversation about U.S. weapons abroad. I think one of her final votes as a senator was that she was against sending weapons to Israel. Let's fast forward 5 years later. When she ran for president in 2020 against Biden, she flipped on every issue. She flipped on fracking. She flipped on Medicaid. She flipped on Medicare. She flipped on infrastructure and education. Then she ran again after she took the mantle from Biden and came out with a very progressive policy, right? She's flipped up on every issue. She's not politically married to a set of concepts or ideas. She's very unambitious, and it shows, right? Because when she first was announced as Democratic nominee, the reason why you saw that surge for her in the polls is based off of hope, right? It's kind of like if a stock goes up because you think the stock might do well, so you invest money in it and then you can sell it later on if it increases astronomically. Well, the stock on Kamala Harris has plummeted because they now see that she lacks confidence on television. She dodges answers, and she's very evasive and also abrasive. And Trump, for all of his flaws and imperfections, he's an evil guy. I don't want him to win. He's very charismatic. He can say the most repugnant things ever, but sometimes you can't help but laugh. He says the most repugnant things ever, but his delivery is sharp. Its delivery is coordinated. He has a message that people can remember. Can you remember anything Kamala Harris has said on one specific policy other than, our thoughts and prayers, and I always stand by Israel? I mean, she's not, there's this book that talks about what's needed to be a great president, and sophistication was one of the elements. She's not sophisticated. Maybe she's sophisticated in her accomplishments as an individual, being a prosecutor, being a vice president, now being a presidential nominee. But she's not sophisticated in her presentation of her talking points. People don't remember her. She's not memorable. As a matter of fact, they hear her laugh and they're kind of put off.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned this. There's a book, and it's called Managing Yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It has nothing to do with politics, but it has a political metaphor and analog in there. And it was basically trying to program your life in a way that plays to your strengths. And the argument that one of the chapters in the book makes is that vice presidents typically don't make great presidents. And the example used in the book was LBJ, who was JFK's vice president. And he kept Kennedy's staff after Kennedy was assassinated, but his, I guess his reputation in the press rooms and among the staff took a total dive. And some of it was like the adjustment period of, national crisis, assassinated president. But part of it was that he was a vice president because he was very clinical and organized, and he did certain things in a linear way that his teams responded really well to, and they balanced him out. Whereas Kennedy was charismatic and spoke about vision and had leadership in his, coursing through his veins. And my argument would be that the people who have been vice president, elected to president, have failed the job. George H.W. Bush was Reagan's VP, one term. Maybe the smartest guy ever to have been in the seat of running the CIA and then being vice president for 8 years. He knows the inside of Washington inside out, but he was a one-term president. Joe Biden, Washington insider, politically connected, knows everybody, hustled up votes on the Senate floor when he needed to, spoke to, his beliefs and policies as politicians do. But was he charismatic and a leader? No, he was an escape valve. He was punting the ball when defense is on you, and people didn't want Trump for a second term. But was he, a great leader? We can tell by how he speaks and his lack of charisma, and certainly not to be ageist, but, in a position of the leader of the free world, you have to be able to finish a sentence. And he hasn't been able to do that for a couple of years now.
Mm-hmm.
And Kamala Harris was meant to balance out the ticket. That's what all of the last few election cycles minimally have been structured to do. Pence balancing out the conservative Christian Midwest vote or Deep South vote to Trump on the 2020 ticket, or the 2016 ticket, sorry. So, Biden had made a promise. He cast Kamala for it. It's a casting position in so many different ways, but VPs by design are ticket balancing acts, not grooming somebody for, being president when the incumbent's term runs out. I just don't think that it's structured for that. That's less a criticism about Kamala's policies, but she hasn't stepped up. If anything, she's just kind of like ridden the fumes of the relief that everybody felt when Biden stepped down or was forced out, because everybody, to your point, was waiting with bated breath. Okay, what's this going to mean? Let's give her a shot. Let's let her articulate her position. She's got a lot on her plate. She knows that this is a burning issue. What is she going to say? And everybody waited, and then she started off with the, concerned face Kamala, and she moved very quickly to doubling down on no policy change. I am Biden all the way. And, how can you blame that on American voters, on Arab American voters, when the party left us?
Yeah, and I think that's a concern that a lot of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans have, is that they're starting to see that the Democratic Party is, or should I say, social media is not indicative of everything, but it tells you a lot. And I think if you see a lot of how media pundits and just regular, ordinary social media users are responding, is that if Kamala Harris loses, we're going to know it's the Muslims' fault. Well, if Trump gets elected, I hope they get deported. So they're responding with these horrific racial lines. And I think this is the large problem with the Democratic Party, is that there's just so much hubris, and that they assume and expect loyalty from everybody. And that was the biggest downfall of Hillary Clinton's campaign. She abandons Michigan and Ohio. She doesn't really campaign Pennsylvania. She just expected these 3 states to automatically go to her. She calls all Trump supporters a basket of deplorables, but little does she know, she has to kind of keep those ex-Obama voters in her bracket in order for her to win, and they leave. And I think the Democratic Party now, 8 years later, after Hillary Clinton's catastrophic loss, is that they continue the same hubris of we don't need to adjust, people need to bend their expectations to what we do, when in a democracy it's supposed to be the other way around. The power is invested within the will of the people, the will of the governed, the will of the sovereign. And the Democrats act as if that element, that formula for what's supposed to make American democracy unique, does not apply to them. Right? I mentioned the term the mafia a little bit. Okay, it's like once you leave the Democratic Party or you start to question it, you get quote unquote whacked, you get hit. And now you're starting to see the hit pieces being put on Arab and Muslim Americans for not being loyal enough to Joe Biden, for not being loyal enough to the fact that he built this pier in Gaza that did nothing and disintegrated and floated out onto the sea. And now we're not being loyal to Kamala Harris for saying that she wants this war to end. And they can't recognize the fact that these community does not want platitudes. We want policy change. And I mean, I know early voting starts here in 2 days here in Michigan. I'm going to go vote. Like, halas, the damage is done. There's nothing the Harris campaign can do now to win back hearts and minds. They're going to the voting booth or early mail-in ballot or whatever the case may be, and they're internalizing how they're already being blamed and ostracized and castigated for what seems to be an impending Democratic loss. And I almost feel that's indicative of the party itself. They're defeatists. They know they're going to lose. And when you got swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, I know this for a fact. Michigan's only went Republican twice, for Trump and for Ronald Reagan. And that's like what, in the past 50, 60 years. If Kamala Harris is up 1%, that means she's losing by 2. If she's up 3%, it's a tie. And if it's a tie, that means Trump's probably winning by 3. So Trump's winning the state right now. And when you got 400,000 Arab Americans in the state and they feel abused, ostracized, and alienated because you don't want to hear them out and you want to operate with this hubris, well, it's going to come back to bite you again. It's like they don't learn their lesson at all. Democrats, yeah. That is. Listen, I could be wrong. Maybe Kamala Harris wins. There are other swing states, but traditionally, if you don't win Michigan and or Pennsylvania, it's never happened, right? It's never happened in the history of an election.
Yeah, I think as I hear you speaking about the Arab attitudes and the internalization already of knowing that we're going to be blamed for this if she loses Michigan. And, again, this is your feeling and my feeling that she's going to lose Michigan. And it's just, I felt that back in November. And literally I've been sitting with my words in a draft for the longest time because I kept thinking, am I getting too far ahead of myself? Do I really think this is going to happen? And my gut has told me over and over and over again that this is going to happen. And if I'm wrong, the problem is, if I'm wrong and Kamala Harris wins, the situation doesn't improve for Palestinians or Arabs.
No,
because
you're not wrong.
Because she's indicated already, and the machine is already done everything to abscond with the truth, to lie to the American people that they've been working on a ceasefire when they haven't, to, lie about what control they have over ending aid or, pushing for a ceasefire with the lifting of a phone and making a call. But they're part and parcel of a genocide on Arab Americans. And, I think if we were blue no matter who people, we would be heavily shamed for even vocalizing this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And we already have. You probably have faced some of this yourself, but I certainly have as well. And I think there's a part of this that is like, do you not see us? Do you not hear us? And, this is where the media has played such an important role in the dehumanization over decades of Arabs in news. Arabs in entertainment, always portraying them as the terrorist. It's much easier to position somebody as subhuman when you've been reinforced by these messages over and over again. And I would say the biggest sin of media today is leaving Arabs, and in this case, Palestinians, out of the mix, out of the conversation. All of these talking heads on these shows fail to bring a Palestinian to the table.
You're bringing individuals who are smart in their own right, but not well versed on the issue to represent one of the most contentious, bloodiest conflicts of all time, but also to talk about the longest standing occupation of a group of people right now in the world, and the Palestinians, by the Israelis. You mentioned how in November of last year, a month into the genocide, Democrats, insiders, Arab Americans were saying, listen, like, if you don't put your foot down and stop Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant and Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who are the architects of Palestinian suffering, pain, and genocide, it's going to cost you this election. And they ignored that. And Biden's inability to resolve this issue in a very small and slight defense of Kamala Harris, who I don't support and don't like, so I want to make that clear, has now inherited an issue that, quite frankly, she's not equipped to handle. She doesn't have a foreign policy background. She's never been a diplomat. She's rarely communicated with other foreign leaders. She's never really sat down with Arab Americans up until at least this point. So she doesn't have an internalized understanding of what's happening on the ground, other than what she's been told, and she's accepted that as reality. And I think right now, what people don't seem to understand is that Palestinians, Americans, have been working within the political system for a long time. We've worked in the government, State Department, DOD. We've pledged loyalty to our country. Our diaspora is one of the most successful and educated in the world. You never hear about a Palestinian doing something bad in this country, ever. A crime, an act of terror, doing something inappropriate or gross. They're one of the most accomplished, sweetest, nicest people ever. I know Palestinian Americans that before October 7th had an American flag flying in front of their house and always told me, be American and present yourself as American, basically saying assimilate to this way of life. And you have some Arab Americans in this country who have kind of shedded parts away of themselves so they can fit in, so they're not discriminated against, so they could be taken more seriously. And what did they get for that? Nothing. We've lost. I'm not calling people out, because this is just part of reality whenever you immigrate and you go to a new country, but like, we've lost parts of ourselves, of who we were in the process to live here, to prove ourselves, so people could take us seriously and not harm us, only to have bombs being sent to go kill our own people. And that's, I think, another attitude that's not being talked about enough, is that you might provide a life of sustenance here for us in America, Arab Americans, that is, right? America to Arab Americans. But when you're sending bombs overseas to kill their motherland and their brethren, you're killing parts of them already. And it's just so dehumanizing and anguishing to see, because we're so helpless. It's every day we wake up and we're like, why us? Why are we here? Why did we survive? Why are we living? Why are we here living in the comfort of the West when our people are dying in Gaza and Lebanon?
It just seems to also fly in the face of all of the values we've been told are a part of America, living in the U.S. The value for life, and every day just the sheer number of children that I see in videos shredded, attacked, targeted, shot in the head, shot in the chest. The denial, the deep denial of that suffering, what it represents, the reality of it, the generations of trauma that this will bring to humanity. Even if you can shrug this off and say, it's not my people, I'm not connected, I don't have skin in the game, it defies logic because of the eternal trauma that will be handed down in generations to come, and our ability to look back at this time and say, wow, what an atrocity. While it was happening and streaming on our phones, we failed to stop it. I feel, as much as I would like to feel the hope in this moment that maybe a dramatic shift in our politics will arise from true disaster. Um, but the part that hurts most is, seeing children um, constantly um, victimized and killed intentionally as
Yeah.
children. I can't.
Yeah,
I can't reconcile it. It's always wrong. It's always wrong.
it's always wrong to harm, kill women and children. And I think that the death toll the media is working off of right now, Gaza, is about 42,000, while 20,000 of them have been women and children, and they're being targeted as if they're armed combatants or militants, and they're being killed in one of the most horrific ways ever. And I think for any Americans listening to this right now, and this has always been my message to other Americans, is that even if you don't have skin in the game, or even if you're not an Arab, even if you're not Palestinian, even if you're not Lebanese, even if you're not Sudanese, or even if you're not from Yemen, is that when bombs are being sent by America to go kill these children, whether or not we want to confront that, their blood is on our hands. And there is no amount of water or cleansers or soap that's going to be able to make us wash our hands of the sin. It will always be a stain on those who have stood by, said nothing, and did nothing, and enabled it. And you could correct me if you think this might be too sensitive of a topic to discuss, but I want people to hear me say this, is that in cases of war, or in the case of trying to reconcile with an occupation and denigration of a group of people, when Israel responds so horrifically, right? Israel's sole goal, they said, was to quote unquote beat Hamas, right? They wanted to beat Hamas militarily, whatever the case may be. They've gone so scorched earth uh, in Gaza right now that they've not only, I think, guaranteed Hamas's survival as a political idea and as a militant group, uh, but they have created, like you talked about, a generation of trauma. There's going to be a generation of revenge of Palestinians and Lebanese who are going to remember this moment. It's going to be a catalyzing moment in their lives of they're going to remember who killed them, and they're going to remember who did this to them. And whether or not it's right or wrong to respond militarily or with arms, they're going to do that. And I think whenever we talked about the rise of militant groups, the rise of terror groups, whatever people want to call them, in often cases, wherever there's been an occupation in human history, I want to invoke history here. When the UK occupied Northern Ireland, that spawned the IRA, and the IRA admittedly did some horrific things as a way to respond to that. But ultimately, the UK left Northern Ireland alone, and now the IRA is basically governing. The FLN in Algeria, when the French occupied them, they responded militarily. They fought, and they were killed and victimized for generations, for centuries, decade and decade after, and they responded until they got their freedom. Same thing in South Africa with the African National Congress. No matter how hard the occupier responded with vengeance, vindication, hatred, starvation, disease, slaughter, the groups, the idea of fighting never went away. So my message to the world is that when you slaughter Palestinians in Gaza and you make them orphans and you starve them with no food or water, what do you think they're going to grow up and do when they have nothing to go to but the barrel of a gun? And it's sad. And it's not something I'm advocating for, but it's a phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that people need to understand. That violence genuinely does beget violence.
With that, um, this has been a very informative hour with you. I really appreciate it. This has been a fantastic way to hear from a Palestinian perspective on the ground in Michigan. I really appreciate your political analysis. Abdelhalim Abdelrahman. I want to do it the Arabic way first, and then thank Abdel or AJ for the folks who don't have flavor, who just can't pull it off, who can't get into accents or anything like that. But I want to reconnect with you. Like maybe after the election, we can just do a recap.
Yeah.
And see if we can reconnect and have a conversation to see where the chips fell. But If not, then we'd love to have you on again. The one thing that we have on the Arabs and Media podcast is we have a segment called the Shout Out, and it's basically an opportunity for you to call out anybody or anything that is hopeful, positive, or doing good. So is there anybody or anything top of mind that you want to call out? And we'll also be able to link your socials and anything that you want to shout out on the notes of this podcast and in the Substack that will accompany this.
Man, I don't even know how to answer that question. I would say, first and foremost, I want to give a big shout out to all of the protesters before I even address media members. So many young college students have, and I can say this as somebody that's interacted with so many college students here in Michigan, kids from the University of Michigan, kids from Michigan State University, kids from Wayne State, kids from U of M Dearborn. They've gone up against a machine, basically, and speaking out against the injustices against the Palestinian people, and they've put their livelihood, their careers, their education on the line to speak truth to power. And their sacrifices cannot be overstated. Secondly, I want to give a big shout out. I probably should have said this first, honestly, forgive me, is the people of Gaza and Lebanon for enduring. Uh, for enduring, for those who have survived. We will do whatever we can to honor you, and we will do whatever we can to avenge you within the most peaceful means of advocating that your suffering and your burdens be lifted. You are not alone in this world. Even though we may be far, you're very close to our hearts. And I also want to give a shout out to really my mother, my father for always encouraging me to speak my mind. I love them very much. And I really don't know what else to say because I sometimes genuinely feel very insignificant. Because who am I to kind of assert on what's happening in the world? Because me being able to speak about these things, it's a privilege to be able to draw breath on this earth, knowing that people who look like you, breathe like you, talk like you, pray like you, are related to you, are being just massacred. I don't want this to just be another show that people listen to. I want this to kind of be a rallying call that if you are an Arab American, if you are a Muslim American, or if you are an American who cares very deeply for the injustices of the world, now is the time to rise up and show the powers to be that we will not be complicit and we will not be silent as you find a way to continue to your pitiful genocide. My last message is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. One day we'll all go back to a free Palestine and a free Lebanon, and there won't be settlements or bombs everywhere. We'll live in peace and enjoy the soil of our lands.
Beautiful. Wow. I have the hair on my arm standing up. I couldn't have asked for a more heartfelt conversation, and I hope your parents are as proud of you as I am as a fellow Arab and as a fellow Michigan State Spartan.
We're going to beat Michigan this week. I'll end on a little bit later of a note. Go green, by the way.
Yeah, go green, go white. Absolutely. Go State. All right. Well, we'll talk to you soon. We'll link all of your socials. You want to throw your Twitter to the crowd on audio while we're here so that we can put that out?
Yeah, follow me on Twitter at Abdel1924. The A in Abdel is capitalized, and the A standing alone is also capitalized. I don't know why I have 1924. I guess that's just whatever. But yeah, follow me on there. I do political analysis. I write op-eds. I tweet. I quote other people. I also have another article coming out soon, inshallah, on foreign policy, talking about the Lebanese community here in Michigan and both the emotional and electoral impact it's going to have in the coming weeks. I was also honored to have a conversation with Mayor Abdelhalim. Actually, shout out Mayor Abdelhalim. He's been such he's been such a big voice in the Arab American community and speaking out for right and sticking up for the injustices against the Palestinians and the Lebanese. He's really a man of men, and he's somebody that I think is going to really leave his fingerprints on this world.
I agree. Just with the little exposure that I've had of him, he's just extremely well informed and thoughtful and kind. Just the ability to speak towards the cares of a community that are being deeply impacted, whether it's related to the genocide or just, the Dearborn community. So
Yeah,
a big admirer here as well.
certainly.
Your Twitter is great. I've really enjoyed it. I had to actually, because I couldn't find out how to reach you and had seen one of your media interviews, I was like, okay, put on my sleuth hat and my like magnifying glass. Felt a little bit weird, but I actually found your Twitter and messaged. I had to activate an account that I just had as a placeholder because I'm not much on Twitter, even though I certainly benefit from being on there. We can only do so many platforms, so I've tried to focus on Instagram and Substack for Arabs in media. But your Twitter is great. Your insights are fantastic. They're to the point. They're definitely real. They're unfiltered. They're very informative. So congratulations on the work that you're doing. Looking forward to your article in Foreign Policy. We didn't. We kind of combined talking a lot about the issues with Lebanon through the conversation of the genocide, but it is, just as heartbreaking to witness, the random bombing of people. How else can you put it? When you have, and people don't, I think, also grasp the concept of knowing people there
Mhm.
and what that means. Center somebody else in your life for a second, and just try to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who is just under assault
Yeah.
because of the money tied to bombs. It's pretty
Uh,
rotten. Anyway,
those four words really encapsulate why we're here: is money tied to bombs.
yeah, yeah. All right, Abdelhalim, great to have this conversation, and we hope to meet you again here soon on Arabs in Media once again.
Inshallah, I look forward to it very much.